Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the final day of the IGF. We're very grateful for you all for joining on this very early time start to the Freedom Online Coalition's event on how technical standards can shape connectivity and inclusion. My name is Laura O'Brien. I'm Senior International Counsel at Access Now, and I'll be the moderator for the session today. And I'm joined by an esteemed group of panelists who are very expert on this topic. To start us off today, I will hand the floor over to Rasmus Lumi, Director General, Department of International Organizations and Human Rights from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Estonia to do welcoming remarks. Over to you, Rasmus.
Thank you very much, and welcome everyone to this morning session here, which addresses a critical yet often overlooked pillar of our digital world, which is the technical standards. These standards are the backbone of global connectivity, enabling data to move seamlessly across borders, ensuring the interoperability of our networks, and supporting the expansion of affordable digital services. From undersea cables to data transmission protocols, standards underpin the very systems that make the internet work. But this infrastructure is only as strong and as just as the processes behind it. Too often, standard-setting bodies like ITU, IETF, and others operate without sufficient input from the global south, from the civil society, or marginalized communities. This lack of inclusivity risks reinforcing the digital divide and leaving critical voices out of decisions that shape our joint future. We need open, transparent, and multi-stakeholder models for setting standards too, models that reflect the full diversity of the global digital community. In its joint statement of 2024, the Freedom Online Coalition, which Estonia is leading this year, has emphasized the importance of rights-based, inclusive approach to digital policy. And at the same time, Estonia's own leadership in digital governance shows what's possible when innovation is paired with openness and accountability. As we navigate complex issues, cybersecurity, infrastructure, resilience, emerging technologies like quantum communications, we must ensure that standards evolve, not just to meet technical needs, but to align with broader goals like human rights, sustainable development, and global cooperation. Let's use this space today to explore how we can make standard setting more equitable, more collaborative, and more future-ready. By doing so, we can help build a digital ecosystem that is not only connected, but also inclusive, secure, and truly global. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rasmus. Our session today will delve into how open and interoperable standards can bridge digital divides, enhance connectivity, and ensure affordable access to vital digital services in underserved regions. We'll be focusing on the critical role of standards in global communication infrastructure, such as undersea cables, data transmission, network compatibility, and cybersecurity. We will explore how emerging technologies demand adaptive, resilient frameworks. Despite their crucial impact, international standing-setting bodies such as the ITU, IETF, IEEE, W3C frequently operate with limited stakeholder engagement. Our discussion today will highlight the barriers to inclusive participation and propose concrete strategies to foster greater transparency, accessibility, and representation. We will also examine how aligning technical standardization with human rights, digital inclusion, and the Sustainable Development Goals can support key WSIS action lines, driving a more equitable and secure digital future. Through expert insights and collaborative dialogue, this panel aims to chart actionable pathways towards making standard-setting processes more open, collective, and representative, building a global digital ecosystem that works for everyone. In terms of the format, we'll do one round of questions from the panelists, and then we'll open the discussion for more of a Q&A from you all. We'll then conclude with the three main takeaways from this session and any other closing remarks from the panelists here today. So I'd like to start off by introducing our esteemed panel. First, to my right, I have Mr. Divine Abekti, and I apologize for any mispronunciation of names, the Director General of Cybersecurity Authority of Ghana. Pleasure to have you. I also have Stephanie Borge Sila, Director for Digital Policy of Diplo Foundation. Great to have you here. And then immediate left, I have Natalie Turkova, at-large advisory committee, ICANN, and founder and chair of IGF Czechia. And then on my very far right, Alex Walden, global head of human rights, Google. And finally, but last but not least, Rose Payne, policy and advocacy lead from Global Partners Digital. So I think we'll just dive right into it with my first question to Mr. Devine. How can open and interoperable technical standards help bridge the digital divide, particularly in underserved regions and among marginalized communities?
Thank you very much. Actually, I am honored to represent Ghana at this important roundtable on the role of technical standards in shaping more inclusive, secure, and interoperable digital future. As a nation at the heart of Africa's digital transformation journey, Ghana sees technical standards as governance instrument that impact rights, inclusion, and sustainable development. So firstly, open and interoperable technical standards are foundational to bridging the digital divide. They lower the cost of connectivity and technology adoption, especially in underserved communities. And we have seen this a lot throughout the country, and I'll come to that, especially in our financial inclusion activities. It fosters competition by allowing multiple vendors to interoperate, reducing lock-in and also promoting affordability in that aspect. And it also enables local innovation and adaptation, such as African language support in mobile applications and digital platforms. So for some time now, in our financial institutions in Ghana, many years ago, we only had the traditional banks, for example, and that cuts away about 80% of the population who were peasant farmers, market women, and tradesmen who never had access to bank accounts or never thought there's a need for that. But then the insertion of technologies and interoperability came in, and locally we were able to develop mobile applications and introduce what we call the mobile money applications. And interestingly, it's not only in Ghana, it's across the continent. So when you go even to East Africa, you have M-Pesa, which is there, and we work with the mobile networks to establish this. In that aspect, everyone is able to put in a smaller code and they're able to transfer money. You can walk to a vendor and then put money into your own mobile wallet and also transfer money to people across the country. So as a result, especially in the mobile money, it has enabled over 80% of the adult population to access basic digital financial services. And by avoiding the vendor proprietary limitations, interoperability has become a driver of that financial inclusion in Ghana. And today I can gladly say that even me, in person, I don't see the need to walk into a bank. I sit even right here in Norway, and I'm able to transfer money to my mother who is right in a village, and also be able to transfer from the mobile wallet account to my brother's bank account, no matter where he is. So these are the way technical standards can help support digital inclusion.
Thank you very much. It's very helpful to have the perspective, not only from Ghana, but to see the regional and bringing in the financial institutions. So that's very, very helpful to kick us off on this discussion today. My next question is to Natalie. What are the main barriers to inclusive participation in global standard setting processes, and how can these be addressed to ensure more diverse stakeholder engagement?
Thank you so much. So if I would look at this through the lens of someone who is focusing on end users within the various roles that I have in the community and focusing on the interest of the end users, well, I would say it's very important to mention that these standards, technical standards, might sound distant or very abstract to many of these people, but they actually do shape the way we all connect, the way we are all online, we communicate, and also access all the opportunity that we have. So this is very important to start with, so that standards really do affect all of us, everyone. But the everyone isn't usually in the room when everything is being said and done and talked about. So historically, we can see that technical standard setting has been mainly, let's say, motivated and being done by engineers, industry, government agencies. And so environments that are just not traditionally open or even accessible, even if you really want to, for everyday users or just public interest advocates. And we can just talk about the main barriers, right? But I would say the main thing is, of course, the lack of awareness, because typically you're not invited. There's no advertisement where all these discussions are being held. So there's no increased participation or opportunities for the end user communities. And much of the work is just being done behind a closed door. And of course, once something goes wrong, then we start to take these discussions again as an open thing, try to resolve what was being done wrongly. However, then of course it's harder to somehow change it. So there is now the growing recognition how the standards are just not neutral, and they can just embed values or affect human rights in a way that we just don't think about, because we don't even invite these people who can pinpoint and tell us in advance that, well, this is actually not the right decision, this is not the right way to go. But then once this is all being said and done, it's just way too complicated to go back and change it. So definitely, if I want to be positive about this, and I want to, not just to make the points of the negative things, in order to change and maybe overcome these barriers, I would suggest strongly that we try and do our maximum to have all these important conversations and be more open to different stakeholders back when we are having all these initial discussions, so that also the process is much smoother and, of course, eventually cheaper. So to provide some space and open seats for those who advocate for end users, who know well the realm of human rights and can really help us overcome these obstacles at the very beginning. These can be observing roles or specifically design seats for these type of people and stakeholders. And then, of course, all these processes tend to be, let's say, very technical. So I just want to mention the language barrier we don't usually think about. So me, mainly in my day job, apart from all this, which I love to do, I'm an academic, and I know that sometimes we forget that the language we use can create this big barrier to the normal, I don't like to use the word, but like the regular end user, my grandma. I also want her to understand what is being done, why these things look the way they look, how come these findings can actually affect her in her everyday life, even though it doesn't seem possible. And so that also being able to translate what is being discussed on also the technical standard setting level to everyday end users is very crucial. Otherwise, even if we invite them, but they're intimidated because they just don't understand, they don't want to feel just dumb, and they should not be in the room because they're not engineers, then eventually, even if we open these seats, they will just not come. So also take a step back and try to be more open, more inclusive by design as we discuss all these things. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you, Natalie. I think that was helpful to get kind of more of the historic perspective, and then also highlighting some of the main barriers, such as the lack of awareness, the fact that these settings are very strongly technical, and the need to center on and advocate for the end users. So I really appreciated that. Perhaps I could piggyback off a little bit more on this, what could be the solutions. I know you offered a little bit a perspective on that in terms of the observing rules, but to inclusive participation in global standard processes, and how can we address these to ensure more diverse stakeholder engagement?
Thank you so much. So, of course, apart from the dedicated seats or just specific roles that we can set up for them, then another thing is that usually to be part of such communities or just the committees themselves, sometimes you do have to pay a certain fee, like a membership fee, to even enter the environment and be able to meaningfully participate. So, of course, if there is a financial barrier as well, this should be something I would suggest we reconsider, especially for those from civil society, and that usually do face the barriers when it comes to finances, and this is usually the main issue. So, of course, I would also advocate for this thing, and then focusing on also some form of vulnerable end users, such as the youth as well. We can see in many organizations they are now forming youth panels. Also bringing these perspectives of the generation that will be affected by all the standards that we adapt now these days. So also bringing these people to the same room and trying to discuss with them what they see as challenging. Maybe they already have some fears. And sometimes when I have these conversations with young people or vulnerable groups of end users, such as people with disabilities. And then, of course, all these groups can merge, right? We tend to forget that. So we can even have young people with disabilities or people from regions where connectivity is just a real issue. And these people have some additional obstacles, additional barriers. So just bringing them in without creating, again, the barrier of language, the barrier of membership, fees, and all these, that could really help. Then, of course, just being able to promote when these things are happening. Also maybe enable some form of virtual participation. Sometimes we can see that once, let's say, a first draft is being adapted, then it can be open for public comments or for comments from all these that could be just in these specific roles seated at the table. So that could be something that could be very helpful eventually. And then, of course, just overall raise some awareness and try and bridge the sphere of very technical, sometimes very hard to grasp, let's say, documents to the end users when it comes to explaining what does it mean, how these things can actually affect them, providing examples, so focusing more on the knowledge enhancement as well. I think all these together in a very naive situation and a utopian perspective, that would be the ideal recipe to overcome some of the obstacles that we see today.
Yes, thank you, Natalie. I appreciate how you took the focus more broadly on the end users and narrowed it down to, the youth, persons with disabilities, looking more about the vulnerability aspects. And of course, we're all, facing, many barriers in terms of access to processes from a financial perspective, but also I think there's ways of overcoming that. And I appreciate your option on the virtual participation. We've seen that work really well in different hybrid modalities, and it's a good way to make sure that we're engaging with stakeholders from all over, and to bring them into these processes. So thank you. Next, I'll turn over to Stephanie. In what ways can technical standardization and maybe with respect to digital technologies, communication infrastructure, data transmission, network compatibility, and security, which is quite a bit, be better aligned with international human rights law, contribute to digital inclusion, and advance the Sustainable Development Goals?
Thank you, Laura. I will answer the question actually by rewording it. So I would say that technical standardization can contribute to digital inclusion and advancing the SDGs by being better aligned to international human rights law. So I've turned that a little bit around. And building on what Divine said, there are multiple everyday examples of how technical standards are bridging the digital divide. Divine mentioned the M-Pesa and the financial related solutions. There's the Aadhaar in India, which also is a very similar example. So the Aadhaar has enabled millions to access banking and social welfare, and through the Know Your Customer, the APA standard, it has reduced the onboarding costs for financial services. Another example is the use of TV white space standards in some countries in Africa, and that has enabled broadband delivery to rural areas using the unused spectrum, right? And another example, building also on what Natalie has said, it's accessibility standards, right? So, for instance, the web content accessibility guidelines that have made web content more inclusive for persons with disabilities. I've just taken 3 examples, but there are many more. But obviously, we need to ensure that these technical standards are aligned with human rights law. I will be stating the obvious, right? So standards should not enable surveillance, exclusion, data misuse, etc. And to prevent these harms, the discussion needs to take place from the outset. So I would say that that is one of the key points, right, to make if the discussion does not take place on the outset, as Natalie said, then it's very difficult to solve. I'm also reflecting a little bit on what Natalie just said regarding the solutions. At Diplo Foundation, we're the lead partner in a project. It's called CADE, Civil Alliances for Digital Empowerment. And one of the things that we've done is we've mapped the barriers for inclusion, for participation, focusing on civil society from the global majority. Right? But we went a little bit deeper in the sense that we looked at some of the main standardization fora, and we said, all right, in each of these fora, right, what are the specific barriers? So we went a little bit granular to identify, for instance, what are the issues at the ITU, what are the issues at the IETF, at ICANN. Some of the issues are the same. Some are quite specific to these fora, right? So what we really believe and are working on is for there to be finally some structural changes coming from the top that will finally solve issues for civil society participation. And you mentioned the membership fees. It's a non-starter for CSOs, right? So how can we even begin to say that we need to hear civil society voices when the door is shut for civil society, right? So certain barriers are literally, they're a non-starter for CSOs, let alone being able to speak the same language, understand, etc. But what we're also saying is that, so we're trying not to approach it in a, let's say, in a naive way. So there are aspects that civil society need also to look at to be able to, let's say, help themselves, help their cause. And one of the issues that we are working on, one of the aspects is on helping civil society, helping end users, helping communities understand why they need to be in the room. And these are the examples I mentioned, the examples Divine mentioned. These are the everyday things that matter, right? So, CSOs, civil society organizations, they also need to be made aware that their contribution is essential because what is being decided and what is being developed and later implemented in some of these spaces that we're mentioning affect them directly on an everyday level. So I'll stop there. Thank you, Laura.
Yes, thank you very much, Stephanie. That was very helpful, and I think If you can, or maybe elaborate more on some of the issues that you mentioned specifically within the ITU, within IETF, would you be able to do that?
Yes, yes, of course. So we have the mapping study published on the CADE website. So I'll be happy to share the URL after the session, or we have a CADE booth here. Essentially, there are issues that are like quite similar, right? But for instance, for the ITU, there's the famous membership cost, right? You have to be a sectoral member to participate. There are some, let's say, not exceptions, but other stakeholder groups are able to access ITU discussions. Why not civil society, right? So to me, it doesn't make sense that you have huge membership fees for CSOs, and the exclusion, the exceptions, right? They are still very difficult to, let's say, tap into, right? Because of the conditions attached with them. Within ICANN, there are perhaps the decisions on where the face-to-face meetings are held. What we're suggesting is that the location takes into account, for instance, small island states, which are, for instance, in the Pacific, in regions which normally are rendered automatically inaccessible because of the huge traveling costs, etc. So perhaps a change in how the rotation takes place. At the IETF, one of the main challenges is the language, because the IETF discussions are predominantly in English, right? So how about real-time interpretation, right? And we're not saying 1,000 different languages, right? We had a lightning session the other day. We looked at the languages that I'm seeing a couple of people smiling. Probably they were part of the session. But we had this experiment, right, of finding which languages are perhaps the most common rather than English. In the whole space where we organized this lightning session, only I think 1 or 2 persons were English native speakers, right? So English was their mother tongue. For the rest of the participants, it was not, right? So again, interpretation to enable, for instance, there are huge communities in Latin America which are very much interested in the work of the IETF, but the language is a barrier. So why not include Spanish, right, in real-time interpretation? So it's granular issues like this that the mapping has identified in a very granular way.
Yes, thank you, Stephanie. I think this mapping exercise and looking at the specific bodies is very helpful for us to all understand the specific issues within each body and ways to address that. And bringing back to the international human rights law aspect of the question and the discussion today, I think the joint statement from the Freedom Online Coalition that Rasmus mentioned in the beginning on technical standards and human rights in the context of digital technologies could be really influential in trying to address and bridge those barriers. Having a bunch of FOC governments committing to these principles from a human rights perspective is really helpful in advancing moving forward. So thank you for all those suggestions. My next is over to Rose. What role do technical standards play in ensuring the security, reliability, and interoperability of critical infrastructure like subsea cables, which is an increasingly interesting topic? And how can international cooperation and multi-stakeholder partnerships strengthen their governance?
Great, thank you so much. I'm so glad to have a chance to be here with you all. Just before I move on to subsea cables, I'll give you a bit of info to kind of place me. So my name is Rose Payne. I work for an organization called the Global Partners Digital. We work to ensure that laws, norms, and standards that govern technology are, first of all, rights-respecting, but also created in an open, inclusive, and transparent manner. So as a part of that work, we've worked in multi-stakeholder venues like ICANN, in multilateral venues like ITU, and we're so glad to hear what Stephanie and Natalie have already said, because we've actually run projects to bring global majority civil society into technical standard setting bodies previously. And I think just to pick up on what Divine said as well, I actually got into this field, first of all, through the kind of financial inclusion as a lever for digital inclusion field. So I'm always really happy when someone mentions mobile money. Bringing those kinds of organizations into technical standard setting bodies also helps from actually a technical point of view, because they can bring the point of view of end users who are in low resource, low connectivity environments, who also may be using older technology. In addition, as we've already heard, the role of kind of human rights organizations specifically is that they can help unpack the impact of protocols or standards on the end user and on the functioning of the open, safe internet. And I actually, to bring it back to the technical community, that does actually drive adoption ultimately. So I think that's beneficial for everyone. So just before I move on to subsea cables, I just want to note that while some of what I say aligns with GPD's focus on human rights, actually I'm mostly drawing on research which I've done previously, including through a fellowship for the Internet Society. So technical standards are obviously really vitally important for subsea cables. So they need to withstand a really harsh environment. They're obviously under the sea, and they're vital to the functioning of our societies. They carry some 95 to 99% of all transnational data. They're built and owned often by a consortium of different companies, and they need to make land in at least 2 countries if they're if they're transnational, and to at least 1 landing station where they connect with terrestrial networks. All these points of interconnection are what make the standards so important. Their position is also necessarily a matter of public record. Ships or people carrying out seabed activities need to know where they are so that they can avoid damaging them. So this kind of combined criticality and vulnerability makes standards really, really important. And yeah, I want to give, again, a shout out to, I believe, Laura, that you might be involved in a body at the UN. So there's a joint statement on cables, which was released. Before that, the European Commission's also released a recommendation. And I think that both of these highlighted the value of working with trusted suppliers in a tense geopolitical environment. And I think it's really worth highlighting the role of standards in not only increasing interoperability, but also in raising trust, not in the least because they obviously increase reliability. But I think that question of trust also kind of reveals the limits of technical standards, if you like. One of the main threats to cables is actually cable cutting. I would like to highlight that it seems that that has been rare. Deliberate malicious actors cutting cables seems to be rare, but it is quite difficult to establish malicious intent because, ships may not, they may be commercial ships that have been near a cable when they've been cut. I think that it won't be news to anyone to say that geopolitical tensions are, however, raising this risk. I do want to give a shout out here again to technical standards because they can help gather the information needed to support resilience and feed information into the people who are trying to protect cables. And I'm particularly thinking here about geospatial data standards that help to bring together different types of data which can be used to actually understand risks, if not in real time, in a timely manner. But yes, while I think technical standards are a critical foundation, there is a limit to their effectiveness when it comes to malicious actors in this area. And here, I think that that's where the question of multi-stakeholder partnerships and international cooperation comes in. At the limits of effectiveness for technical standards, you hope that policies provide protection. I think, a lot of these cables are fundamentally international. That means we need international legal frameworks directed at their protection. However, those frameworks, when it comes to cables, are quite out of date. The UN, the UNCLOS was made a long time ago. There have been a lot of efforts to update it. And sorry, UNCLOS is the UN framework which governs the kind of international seabed. And yeah, what those kind of attempts to update that framework have been a little bit slow. I think that, Laura, I'm not sure if you are involved in the International Advisory. No, apologies. Maybe it's someone else, sorry. But yeah, there is an international advisory body for submarine cable resilience, which was established in 2024. But yeah, so I think that there is a bit of a policy gap. I think that also because cables are owned and operated by the private sector, but are critical infrastructure for many countries, this means that while the responsibility for repair may fall on the private sector, the responsibility for protection, for trying to prevent cable cutting, is a little bit less clear. Countries are trying to overcome this by forming smaller alliances. I think NATO has set up a undersea infrastructure coordination cell. Navies are working together to try and prevent or at least track cable cutting, but it's just a really huge challenge. So I suppose my point here is that we need cooperation not only between technical standard setting bodies, but also across governments, private sector actors, and civil society. We really can't afford to get it wrong, because a single damaged cable, depending on where you are in the network, because some countries really are quite poorly connected. They may only have one cable which connects them to the global internet. Tonga has experienced, for example, repeated complete blackouts due to primarily natural disasters. Repairs are often very expensive and slow, which means that countries can remain offline for quite a long time. And I think that in the situation that we're in today, where subsea cables are essentially the foundation for exercising a lot of rights, such as freedom of expression, access to information, right to privacy, through access to the internet, that is a serious, serious problem. And to go back to that kind of question of language, I think having sat in some meetings of where people are discussing technical standards related to cables, there is really a fundamental disconnection between the way that governments talk about them as this kind of geopolitical challenge and the way that technical standard setting bodies discussing the kind of protection of cables, where in a way geopolitics is seen as something which kind of gets in the way of their work. Mm-hmm. So I think, again, that kind of work of translation between different parts of different communities which are involved in the protection and governance of cables is really, really important. Thanks.
Yes, thank you very much, Rose. It's very helpful to narrow in specifically on the undersea cable topic, especially that data, that statistic that's always mentioned about the 90 to 95% of transnational data comes from undersea cables is always something that stands out. And I think you really got to the issue about the trust component in this space, in this discussion that we're having. And I really also appreciated that you mentioned you brought up UNCLOS and the international legal frameworks with relation to undersea cables. While I'm not a part of the body that you mentioned, I have been doing my own research on this topic, having previously worked in the realm of international law of the sea. But I do think, at the point that you also concluded on about the disconnect between governments and the way they talk about subsea cables and the technical standards, and seeing geopolitics as a way that they want to shy away from, I think is something that we need to delve in, especially from the human rights perspective that you also highlighted. So thank you very much for those insights. Finally, I want to turn to Alex. We've heard a lot from civil society perspective, academia, but the private sector has a huge role in this, and I think you will offer some very insightful insights on how ways that the private sector work with civil society and other stakeholders to ensure that there is this human rights-based approach throughout all the stages of the standard development process. So over to you.
Yeah, and thanks so much for including us in this conversation today. It's one of the topics I love most because I think actually it's one of the the topics where we have so much alignment across stakeholder groups. Obviously, as folks have pointed out, there are lots of areas for improvement, but I think we generally have a lot of alignment about the need for continued investment and focus here. So maybe I'm going to do a lot of underscoring what other colleagues have said and sort of plus oneing, but maybe just to highlight a few things. I think the importance of the role of the private sector, most importantly, is to continue to invest in connectivity and infrastructure and interoperability among those things. And so that is something that we are doing heavily. Obviously, Google is a major investor in particular in subsea cables around the world, looking to ensure that there is increased connectivity everywhere from Japan, Australia, new cables in sub-Saharan Africa, et cetera. So that's very important to us sort of philosophically and then obviously for our business. And so that is, I think, a really important area of alignment where the private sector is very much aligned with governments and civil society and communities and wanting to ensure that we're bringing connectivity to everyone everywhere. The sort of important second piece related to that is to ensure that we are committed to human rights and implementing human rights frameworks in the ways that we are thinking about doing all of that work. And so for us, we are involved in places like the Freedom Online Coalition, in the Global Network Initiative, and have commitments to the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. And those are important baselines for understanding how we should think about sort of the high-level principles and then also, you know, more granular ways we should be thinking about how human rights impacts there might be human rights impacts as outcomes of some of the technical standards and the ways we're thinking about expanding connectivity. So ensuring that we are thinking about human rights in the context of all of this work that we're doing. And sort of a maybe separate but related point is ensuring that we're engaging with stakeholders throughout that process. I think we are always talking about how technical standards, there's a lot of I think framing that work is neutral, and of course it is not. There are always ways in which there can be rights-related impacts, positive or negative, and so we need to ensure that it is not just folks who are technologists in those conversations, not just governments and companies, but that we have rights experts at the table helping all of us understand what the potential externalities of any standards might be. And so the last thing I'll say on this is maybe just that I think companies, as we are also wanting to ensure that we have a seat at the table for these conversations because we have sort of an obvious and important role in investing and innovating, is making sure that we are always advocating for our colleagues in civil society and human rights experts in particular to be at the table and advocating to decrease barriers to entry for all of the stakeholder groups that others have been talking about. So I'll stop there, looking forward to others' comments, but I think that's, as we have a seat at the table, it's important for us to reinforce the importance of rights and the importance of all of our expert colleagues being at the table to contribute.
Yes, thank you very much, Alex. I think that's helpful to understand the private sector perspective, linking it back to the work that you're doing with the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. And we do appreciate when companies try to advocate for civil society and for others to be at the table. It's really important that we keep doing that in these spaces especially. That concludes the round of questions with the panelists. So I'd like to open the floor to anyone in the room. If you have any questions, I also understand that we have those online. So if you're online, feel free to submit a question and we'll have a way of getting it back to the panelists. Okay.
Hi, I'm going to be brief. I'm Israel Rosas with the Internet Society. I think this topic is super relevant. I won't touch on anything about standardization bodies, but particularly on the work related to the ITU sector conferences. We understand that there's a barrier to participate there, and that's why we are trying to work with our community to trying to be this link between the information happening in these regional preparatory meetings. For instance, last year we did an effort for the World Telecommunication Standardization Assembly. Our colleagues are attending the regional preparatory meetings, debriefing the community, taking the input from the community, and trying to be this bridge. We are doing the same for this year's World Telecommunication Development Conference. So my invitation at this point, more than a question, it's an invitation to strengthen the collaboration with the Freedom Online Coalition, with different organizations. If you are interested in getting involved in the work related to WTDC this year, to the plenipotentiary conferences next year, the WTPF, all these sector conferences, we would really love to work together, because we know that we need to bridge that gap regarding the work in the ITU. Either with our chapters, directly with the organization, we are really happy to collaborate with you, and we can explore further ways after the session. Thank you.
Anyone want to quickly comment on that?
I just want to say that one of the chapters is, in fact, one of the Internet Society chapters, in fact, a partner in the project that we are leading. So happy to take the conversation forward.
Yes. And please introduce yourself.
Hi, all, this John, speaking as an individual and having trouble with this thing. Anyway, I'm somewhat disappointed with this panel. One is because you managed to put together a panel about how do technical standards shape connectivity and inclusion, and did not include a single person who actually works with technical standards, as far as I can tell. So this is one of the fallacies that I've seen multiple times in the attempts to so-called bring human rights into the technical bodies, that civil society groups seem to have this idea that they can affect things by standing outside and shouting in, "We let us in," except that, well, the door is open. You're not listening. And as a technologist, I'm an unabashed technologist, I'm part of civil society. I'm part of the people who care about human rights impacts, because I'm a member of civil society. So this false distinction between the technical community that doesn't care and the civil society that cares about all the right things but happens to not understand the technology, this is false. This is not something that is good for progress. So it might be that we should focus on ensuring that the technologists can know about the civil society impact, of course. But don't expect that being outside and shouting in will help.
Rose?
Thank you. And sorry, I'm going to take this off because I can hear myself echoing. Thank you. I completely appreciate your point. I will just say that what I was trying to mention, albeit very briefly, is that actually we have taken civil society into these bodies. We found them, there are challenges. I'm not going to pretend there aren't challenges. I think we've touched on them quite extensively, but we're not saying that they weren't welcomed. We're just saying that there are challenges about translating the kind of different languages. Of course, civil society who specialize in human rights hold a completely different area of expertise to technical experts who are actually working with standards, and finding a way to kind of communicate across those communities is a bit of a challenge sometimes. So a lot of it is about capacity building on the civil society side, but perhaps, just to pick on what you said, we should also be doing capacity building to try and publicize more about what we're trying to do, to try and talk more about how we can actually be helpful to your work. So I take that on board.
Can I add to that? Actually, some language we are trying to avoid is precisely describing civil society as on the outside shouting in, right? Because that language in itself is already a barrier. But building on what Rose said, and I agree with Rose completely, it's the distinction between technical community and civil society. I mean, it's a natural almost distinction. Why? Because the work that we do every day, if I'm not working in standards, right, I can't call myself a technical person. right? And it's the same vice versa, right? So the categories, right? I think they're very much connected to the work we do on an everyday basis, and it's only natural that I call myself, for instance, a lawyer if I'm working on laws, right? I think the main one of the main issues is understanding each other, right? Again, it's not a matter of people who care and people who don't. We all care, maybe about different things, and what people like at the forefront of projects, for instance, bringing CSOs closer to these conversations and helping the people leading these conversations understand civil society. We're trying to act as bridges, right, to literally pull down the walls. A lot has been done already. And in the mapping report, far from being, a compilation of barriers or this has to happen, we've outlined also some of the really, really good practices that are happening in some of the organizations I mentioned. So at the ITU, ICANN, IETF, there are definitely good examples to be modeled across the board. So we bring those out also, and it's those models that we know that some of the models work. So for instance, real-time interpretation, we have that here in the at the IGF, right? We know it works, and it is because these spaces are already implementing some of the issues that we're saying, hey, why don't you try this issue? Because it has helped people to get together and to understand each other more. So definitely not trying to, the compartmentalization beyond what is natural, that we are, I think, trying to avoid. But definitely what you said, taken on board, absolutely.
I know Natalie wanted to come in as well.
I just have a little comment. Thank you so much for saying what you were saying. And I totally agree. I don't like these distinctions because at the end of the day, we are all using the internet as end users, right? So just being in these boxes makes no sense. And honestly, I'm a perfect example of a person who has completely random background, having a psychology degree and a media studies degree. But then just organically being interested in some of the aspects that I was researching, I was like, oh, actually, I need to understand the internet more and come more on different aspects of the issue, understanding the technicalities. So I was low-key and slowly educating myself and eventually started whispering outside and be like, can you let me in? I actually have some ideas, but I also need to learn from you inside. And I'm one of those people who somehow managed to get in, but I can name and highlight these obstacles that I faced. So I just want to say that it's definitely possible to be inside, as you use the metaphor, to be in the room, but it can still be quite bumpy road. So I'm more than happy to be here, and I feel like we all can agree that it is definitely possible. It is the way it should be, but still it is not the smoothest way. So I would say this is just my comment for you. But thank you so much for saying that.
I know we're on 5 minutes at time, so I want the next question, please.
Hi, my name is Colin Perkins from the University of Glasgow. I'm a former IAB member and a long-time IETF participant. Just to sort of echo that previous point, I would note that the process for a technical person coming to a venue like this is also somewhat bumpy at times. I'd also, I think, echo Harold's comment that it is a little disappointing given the large number of people from the leadership of these various standards bodies that you were talking about who are at this meeting, that none of them are included in this panel. Thank you for the interesting debate. It is, you're certainly raising some interesting questions. I certainly agree about the need for inclusion of people from a broader range of backgrounds in the various standards development bodies. On the IETF side, I know the IETF has spent considerable efforts to try and improve inclusivity. For example, it's been providing remote participation in various forms since, I believe, 1992. So there is some efforts going in here. I am, however, concerned that this panel is grouping together the various standards bodies and acting as if they all behave somewhat the same. The models for participation and the membership fees, or lack thereof, in the different standards bodies vary tremendously. The ability to access the final standards, the work-in-progress documents, the ability for anybody to participate in the meetings or not participate in the meetings is wildly different across these bodies. There are certainly some valid criticisms here. I do not doubt that. But there are also perhaps some overly broad statements that have been made which are not representative of all the standards bodies. And I would encourage you to focus your criticism such that it is actionable and the people developing the standards, the people running the standards bodies can actually help address the problems rather than making overly broad statements. Thank you.
Thank you. I noticed that we're at time, so I would like to take this opportunity to highlight 3 of the main takeaways that I've noticed from this discussion today. The first involves the barriers. We discussed language barriers, membership fees, the lack of transparency, but I think the Q&A portion also highlighted the understanding each other and including each other and bearing in mind how these barriers are different across different various bodies. So I appreciate the last comment to acknowledge that they're different in various settings. The second is to build capacity amongst stakeholders. And again, this I think was very highlighted in the discussion amongst government, civil society, technical community, and the private sector. We're disconnected on many fronts, and I think the geopolitical context that we're in does not help in understanding different perspectives and bringing those to the forefront. And of course, in order to ensure that there's access and meaningful inclusion and participation of all stakeholders, we must ground discussions in international human rights law and center international human rights. And I think on a final takeaway, I want to highlight the Freedom Online Coalition's joint statement from 2024 that Rasmus mentioned in the introduction was very instrumental in bringing together those standards. So I believe we should be using that in these processes. And I want to thank you all for joining the discussion today. For listening to the panelists. I want to thank the panelists for their engagement and their expertise on this topic, and look forward to future discussions. Thank you.